We got lots of Americans getting killed in places like Korea, in places like Vietnam. We don't have any Americans getting killed in the Middle East until we get to the Carter Doctrine of 1979.
Dr. Bacevich, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. When did America become militarily involved in the Middle East?
Well, I'll focus on your reference to militarily involved.
Yeah,
The United States has been involved in the Middle East since the earliest days of the Republic. I suppose one could argue even that Americans were involved even before the Revolution. However, the military involvement in my telling of the tale began in 1979 with the promulgation of the Carter Doctrine. Now, some of your listeners would say that can't possibly be the case. America didn't discover the Middle East in 1979.
Yeah.
We had been involved there long before that. And in a sense, of course, that's true. But not true in a military sense. Now, let me concede that during World War II, of course, U.S. troops fought in North Africa. U.S. forces used Persia, modern-day Iran, as a corridor to extend Lend-Lease supplies to the Soviets. But that was a response to a very particular emergency. I guess more to the point, if we look at the period after World War II, as the United States engages in the Cold War, as the US begins to create a global empire of military bases, as the United States begins to embrace military interventionism in places like Korea, places like Vietnam, the Middle East remains an afterthought. There are no U.S. forces stationed in what we would call the Middle East prior to 1979, with two minor exceptions that in a sense make the point. The one exception is that the so-called Fifth Fleet was stationed in the Persian Gulf, headquarters in Bahrain, but the Fifth Fleet basically consisted of 3 ships. It was not a significant fighting force. It was merely a presence. And the other exception that tends to prove the rule is that in 1958, President Eisenhower directed the U.S. forces, a small number of U.S. forces, to intervene in Lebanon. But this was a bloodless intervention that lasted a matter of a couple of weeks. So if we look at the entire period of American global primacy, which I would date from World War II, there are no U.S. forces permanently stationed in the region, except for the small Fifth Fleet, and there are no U.S. forces engaged in combat there. We got lots of Americans getting killed in places like Korea, in places like Vietnam. We don't have any Americans getting killed in the Middle East until we get to the Carter Doctrine of 1979, promulgated by President Carter, which crucially designates the Persian Gulf region as a vital interest of the United States, and in Carter's words, a place that we would now be willing to fight and die for. That statement, the Carter Doctrine, is what initiates the militarization of U.S. policy in the region. It's after the or I should say in response to the promulgation of the Carter Doctrine that we create United States Central Command as a military command responsible for that region. It's in response to the Carter Doctrine that the U.S. begins to prepare war plans to intervene in this region, begins to conduct exercises in places like Egypt to prepare for intervention, begins to negotiate over flight rights and base access, begins to pre-position equipment, for example, in the Indian Ocean, putting in place all the things needed to intervene. Those had not existed until 1979. That's the reason I argued that it is with the Carter Doctrine that the U.S. military involvement down to the present moment, it's in 1979, that narrative really begins.
So let me ask a follow-up question and also clarify a point for myself and our audience. When we use the word military and you use the phrase military sense, we're excluding things such as coup d'etat, such as the 1953 coup d'etat in Iran, and we're excluding things such as providing military supplies and know-how to the regimes of the Middle East. Military sense, you mean boots on the ground in the Middle East, correct?
Yes, I
Yeah.
absolutely exclude covert operations.
Yeah.
Again, the argument here is not that the United States didn't care about the Middle East prior to 1979. The argument is that the Carter Doctrine in 1979 begins the process of militarizing U.S. policy, and the militarization of U.S. policy then leads to a host of other consequences, most importantly, a series of wars that continue down to the present moment.
My follow-up question is this. You mentioned World War II. There was the Tehran conference where Stalin, Churchill, and President Roosevelt actually went to Tehran. Did we replace the British Empire in the Middle East essentially after World War II?
Well, I think the war made the British Empire unsustainable.
Mm-hmm.
I think one could argue that empire per se, formal empire, having colonies, governing people deemed to be of a lesser race. I think as by the time we get to the end of World War II, that entire proposition has been discredited, and therefore the British Empire is doomed. The Brits don't necessarily see that or acknowledge that. I think in retrospect, we can see it and acknowledge that.
Yeah.
So beginning with the immediate aftermath of World War II, a story of British withdrawal from the Middle East begins, and the era of British dominance in places like Egypt and Iran that is now coming to an end. Probably the event that most clearly illustrates that is the Suez Crisis of 1956.
Yeah.
You'll recall, undertaken as a result of a conspiracy involving Great Britain, France, and Israel, with an immediate aim of overthrowing President Nasser in Egypt and reclaiming for France and Great Britain ownership of the Suez Canal.
Yeah.
Nasser having nationalized the canal, that was the trigger for the military action. So this effort on the part of Great Britain to assert great power authority, to demonstrate that the old empire in this region was still sustainable, ends up failing catastrophically.
Yeah.
And I think more than any other particular moment, that's what signals that Great Britain is doomed as an imperial power in the region, and there's going to be a power vacuum. It doesn't follow inevitably that the United States is going to fill that vacuum, but I think when you consider the broader context of the Cold War, pitting the United States against the Soviets, the West against the East, that outcome probably was pretty close to foreordained.
You mentioned the withdrawal of Britain after World War II from the Middle East, which makes me think of this question. Today, we think of Israel as strategically important for our country. Was this always the case, Dr. Bacevich?
No.
No?
I mean, it is certainly true that President Truman, in 1948, when Israel declared its independence, that President Truman, along with the Soviets, hastened to recognize Israel as a legitimate nation state with a place in the international order. And the United States has never retreated from that, rethought that. However, it doesn't follow that we sought to have some warm friendship with Israel. We didn't seek a special relationship. We certainly didn't try to forge a military relationship with Israel. All that would follow in the subsequent decades. So, for example, we take it for granted, I think, as Americans, we take it for granted that the United States provides something on the order of $3 or $3.5 billion of weaponry every year. No strings attached.
Exactly.
Just happens. Bipartisan support. It just happens. Well, that was not the case in the 1950s. The first significant supply of weaponry by the United States to Israel didn't happen until the Kennedy administration in the early 1960s. And significantly, I think, it was a weapons sales. The United States agreed to sell to Israel Hawk missiles, which were then a type of anti-aircraft missile. But they didn't give them to him. They said, you got to pay for these things.
Oh, that's kind of like when we sell stuff. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
You mean sale as in we were not giving them? That's different than what we do now, right?
Bingo. Absolutely different.
Oh.
In other words, right today, that $0.5 billion of what Washington calls security assistance. That's American taxpayer money. In the sale of Hawk missiles by the Kennedy administration, it was Israeli money to pay the United States for those missiles.
I know this next question could be a whole podcast on its own. I'm just wondering, when did that change happen from selling to them versus assisting them, giving it to them for free?
It happens incrementally over time. I think a very significant milestone in that is going to be the Six-Day War of 1967. The Six-Day War has, I think, been radically misinterpreted from several points of view. But it seemed at the time that the very survival of Israel was at risk. And I think that served, in a sense, as a wake-up call, which substantially changed U.S. attitudes with regard to the security of Israel. So beginning with 1967 and then increasing over time, the terms of the relationship change so that the United States ends up providing what it does today.
I see.
At no cost to the government of Israel.
We'll be back after a short break to talk about America's military involvement in the Middle East in the last decades of the Cold War. We'll be right back.